And if you like this, you should come work for us and come make pretty graphs with finance information. So one thing you need to do this and follow along, go to this link and get the tutorial. It's going to have all the stuff that we're going to need to do the presentation. There's a couple of files in it. The one you're going to want to open up is index.html, and that's basically empty. It's just loading D3 and some data. And if you want to follow along with the presentation, inside the presentation, index.html has all the presentation files. That's at github.com/onewheeltutorial. And if you don't have Git or anything, you can just click on download zip in the lower right-hand corner to grab all the files at once. So, what is D3? D3 creates interactive data visualizations for the web. And unlike a lot of other sort of software like Tableau or Excel or R or Python that we might use for visualizing our information, D3 is pretty sweet because everything takes place in the web browser, which means anyone who's looking at the visualization that you've made can actually interact with the data and play with it in a pretty cool way. And just put a couple of links to some cool recent work. This is on the New York Times. It's visualizing different ways that the 2012 presidential election could go. Depending on if Obama wins Wisconsin, then here's all the possible paths to victory, and it sort of updates, and you can sort of play with it and interact with it, which in a way that wouldn't have been possible earlier. The next one is one that I put up recently on my blog, Twisters, and it's a map of every tornado in the United States over the last 50 years, and you can click on a state, and as you do that, the marginal distribution for a bunch of different statistics about the tornadoes in that state update. Like you can see strong tornadoes, when the tornadoes occurred, which direction they blew in, and you can also actually interact with those distributions. So if you want to just get all the tornadoes that occurred before 1970, you can pick that and just see those, or just all the ones that occurred in 1970 and injured more than 30 people. And this really makes data accessible in a way that it would have been possible earlier. Another cool one, also on the New York Times, is tax rates by company, and it just has some pretty interactivity, and the availability of mouse over effects makes it possible to add a lot of, create a visually pleasing presentation while also having high information density because it's easy to kind of investigate what's there. So how do you build things with D3? D3 is built on open web standards, which means that it'll run on Firefox, Chrome.
Adam, the join is not on.
It's not on?
Yes.
Oh, no. Okay. Let me see.
Yes. Share. Yes. Can you show the link again?
Yeah.
You have to keep.
Is that working now? Can someone see?
Can someone go to the link?
Or I guess I can.
Yeah.
Oh.
Just put your name there and Okay, cool.
Sweet.
Does that work for you? It works? Cool.
Yeah, people are joining now, I guess. So the link to join's up there. It's kind of hard to see, I guess. But
Make it bigger.
how do you do that?
The Sublime?
Oh, go back to Sublime?
Yes.
So we have the...
It's join.me/nyc-open-data. You should be remote to see first. Yes, that's
So D3 is built on top of open web standards, which makes it possible for anybody with a web browser to use, and this is sort of limits the people that can use it because IE 8 and earlier don't support open web standards, so if you're stuck supporting those people, you're kind of stuck not using D3, but otherwise it should be available to anybody with a web browser. The standards it uses are HTML, which is just a document markup language, and if you're sort of following modern web development best practices, you put all of your sort of text and structure your data according to HTML, and you style it with cascading style sheets or CSS and sort of make it look pretty and change how everything appears and change colors and sort of position it on the page. And just those two technologies aren't really enough to make a really great interactive visualization. If you want to be drawing squares and circles and lines that are animated, SVGs, scalable vector graphics are another open web technology that D3 uses to make some pretty, cool and beautiful graphs. The piece that ties everything together and the language in which D3 is implemented in is JavaScript, which is the only programming language we have available in the web browser. So if we want to run programs on the web browser through like historical flukes, JavaScript is the only thing we have available. D3 takes a bunch of native JavaScript functions for modifying HTML, CSS, and SVGs and provides really beautiful and pretty wrappers around those functions so we can program in a declarative, intuitive, clean, and simple way. And this sort of talk, and if you have managed to download from GitHub the tutorial and opened up index.html, is going to be structured in two parts. The first, we're going to sort of just go through with plain HTML and sort of talk about how D3 interacts with elements on the page. And once we've got an idea of how it binds things and how we can add and remove elements, we're going to transition to playing with some SVGs so you can see how to make pretty things in addition to just adding data to your page. So if you've managed to open this page, the next step, and it's really best if you have Chrome to open it in Chrome if you want to be able to follow along. It's fine to do it in Firefox if you know what you're doing, but it's going to be a little bit harder to figure out if you're not familiar. So just right click and go to Inspect Element, and we get a nice little, close that, we get a pop-up with the Chrome Developer Tools on the side. And this really has the elements that I was talking about before. In this upper left-hand panel, we see the HTML structure of the page. We can see that there's really not that much here. We just have a HTML tag. We're telling the page to use UTF-8, and we're loading some scripts, and there's nothing else there. On the right-hand side, we're seeing what the styles on the page look like, and there's essentially none because we haven't defined any. And on the very bottom, we have a JavaScript console, which is where we're going to be spending most of the time on this presentation. So, how do we get D3 to do something on this page? If you just type D, it auto-completes to 3 because this script up here has defined D3 and it's been loaded. And we need to tell D3 what we're going to work with. So we're going to do D3.select, and D3 select uses CSS selectors, which, if you're familiar with them, you can grab things by what kind of element they are, what kind of class they are, or what their ID is. And we're using body here to select the body tag. And if we press enter, we get back an array that has a single array in it, which really doesn't look like much. One nice thing, though, if we investigate it a little bit and mouse over, we can see the actual HTML node. It gets highlighted in orange in the upper left-hand corner. So when we're playing with D3, we can actually see the elements on the page that are corresponding to what we've selected, which makes it really easy to go through and debug things. Now, this isn't that much, so let's add some more things to it. One of the things that select gives us, you can append things to a selection. So if we do append H1, that just stands for header 1, and press enter, we'll add a header to the page. And looking in the upper right-hand sort of panel thing, we see that there's now an H1 element on the page. And if we want to select that element, we can with D3.select H1, and we've selected it. This isn't very exciting so far, so let's make which bigger? This one? Okay. We can, with D3 selections, besides just being able to add things to selections, we can also change the text inside of the selection. So if we do D3.select H1 text, we can title this presentation D3 Intro to Binding Data to the DOM. And that just appears on the page. And you can see the text has appeared on the page. And we can also see how the H1 element in our inspector has been altered because of what we've done. And we can also change other properties. We can change any attribute on this H1 element. So if we want to give it an ID, if we want to call it the title of the page, we can just pass it. We can set the ID attribute with title, and looking up here, the title's been updated. And if we wanted to, we can select it now by using the Css Selector for an ID, which is just hash and then the text of the ID, title, and that's going to give us back the same selection we had before, and we could change the inline style of the page. So we can change the color to blue. And the color is changed just like that. So this isn't really the prettiest way of writing things. So another thing you'll notice, every time we press enter, we're getting back the same selection that we have before. We always get back this array with the single array in it, which has our H1 element in it. And what that means is that we can take a selection and chain our modifications of the selection. So if we do D3 select title, and we can change the attribute class and give it a heading class, and we can give it another style and maybe make the font size be 200%. Because each of these selections, when we change the selection, it returns the selection that it's modifying, we can keep chaining this as long as we want to, and it allows us to program in a nice sort of pretty declarative manner. Instead of having to specify the nitty-gritty details of how we're changing the classes and how we're changing the font sizes and the styles, we just tell D3 that we want to change the class to a heading class and change the font size. And I think H2 starts out default to 200%, so that didn't change anything. If you make it 250, it gets bigger. We can also just keep adding some more text to the page, so we'll have something to manipulate. Select body, that append H2. And the join me link is looking a little bit small, so we'll throw it in there. Open data, and that appears. If anybody's getting here late, they're not going to know the Wi-Fi password. I think it's, so what's the SSID? It's
SRS.
Can
Yeah?
you speak louder?
Okay, sorry.
And maybe stand up. You can't hear you from the back.
Okay, so we're going to add the Wi-Fi name for anyone who's came late, and add the password, all things square. Whoops, that's wrong. So now we want to get rid of that element, and if we want to get rid of an element, we can do that with D3 pretty easily, or we can use Chrome's DevTools to do that. It's not how you spell square. And we're at NYC open data. Now, if we want to modify all of these selections, we might try to do D3.select H2. However, that's only giving us back an array with one element. And if we expand it and look down, it's giving us back the first H2 element. And that's because select only looks for the first thing, and then it comes back with the first thing it's found. If we want to select all of the H2 elements, we can do select all, and we get an array of 4, and we have all of them. If we'd like to select all of the text that we've added to the page, CSS selectors let us do a sort of or modification with a comma and a space. So we can do select all H2 or H2, or H1 or H2, and that gives us all the text that we've added so far. So that seems nice, and we can sort of change the attributes in the same way that we've done it before. So, or we can change our style. So if we want to change the color to green, we can do that, and that's going to change the color of every element that we selected. And already this is an improvement of what's built into the DOM, but it's not that impressive. So besides just giving back, being able to pass strings to D3's style and attribute elements, you can also pass a function. And this function, I'm just going to wave my hands a little bit and explain what it's actually doing. We can make every other element on the page be blue or orange. And how is this working? It seems kind of magic that we've just transformed it. We've taken this function and it's done something to these things on the page. And we can sort of get a better idea of what's going on if we just put in a little bit of console logging so we can see what this I and the D that I'm defining are. So with D3 selections inside of functions that you pass to them, you get 3 things. You get the data attached to the element, and just sort of writing idiomatic D3, you always call the data D, probably because it's short, and the creative language sort of writes very short, condensed JavaScript. You also get the index of the element in the selection, and that's by convention called I. And you also get the actual HTML node that the selection is pointing at. So if we run this little snippet, oh darn it, I lost it. So we have the data, the index, and the node, which is set to this. It's going to go through all of the objects in our selection and log what they were. So right now we haven't attached any data to anything on the page, and data is undefined for each, but the index is just the order in the selection, and the node is just equal to the actual thing on the page. If we want to be a little clever or fun, we can change what our criteria for coloring is. So if we wanted to just color things, the first 3 elements is blue, we could do this, or the first 2 elements is blue. So this is pretty nice. Another thing you get for free with D3, if you put a transition before selection, it will slowly change what you've done and apply that style over half of a second. So if we reverse what we've done before, we can run this and they slowly swap back and forth, and you can make it go a little bit slower with dot duration too, if you want to make it dramatic. and that slowly swaps the colors. So that's fun, but this is really only modifying things that exist on the page, and we're sort of bound to coloring things based on little rules that we can define in a function here. If we want to define our own ways of coloring, we can attach data to our selection and then change its colors that way. So we're going to make a little array called colors, and just going to pick some colors: red, green, yellow, and blue are nice colors, I guess. So this is an array of colors, and we're going to go back to our selection, and we're going to attach some data to it. So we're going to take we just call .data and pass it color on our selection, and instead of styling it based on what the index of the element is, we're just going to send style a function that'll take our piece of data. Our D is going to be defined as our color now, and we're just going to set the color equal to that. And the colors update automatically based on the colors that we've passed. And if we go back up to where we were logging the colors, this is going to change what it was. I'm going to set this to each, so it's just going to not modify any styles. It's just going to iterate over every single element in the selection and log what the data, the index, and the node is for each piece. Well, that's not working, so no, that each can't take a string at the beginning, it just takes a function. So we see that now the data basically, our data got bound in the same order that the elements in the array were. So our second element in the color array is red, and our second element in our object selection is also red. And it's just gone through and attached that data to those objects in the DOM. Now, one sort of tricky thing comes up, and there's a little bit of hand waving here, because when we define colors, we set color to have the same amount of elements as our selection. And that's not going to happen a lot of times if, for example, the first time we're adding something to the page, we're not going to have anything selected. So if we make color a little bigger, give it steel blue and pink, and we try to attach it like we did before, we're going to get it back an array with 7 elements, because colors has 7 things in it. But if we look inside of that array, there's only actually 5 elements, or 5 things on the page. And that's because D3 sort of cheated and made 2 shadow elements to sort of mirror the elements in the parts of the array, steel blue and pink, which don't have a corresponding element yet. And we can access those with .datas.enter, and that's going to give us back a selection that just has also 7 elements in it, but it's going to have these the only 2 real things that you can operate inside of this selection are the steel blue and the pink. And just like we appended H1 and H2 to the body, we can take our sort of shadow selections and add new elements based on those. So if we do append H3, and that's going to add a new H3 element for each of the 2 new colors that are entering, and we can add some text to it. So new H3 data, and those show up over there just like that. And they haven't been colored yet because they don't have any we haven't told D3 that we want to color the new elements. Yeah?
No, you appended it once.
What showed? Oh, it showed up twice because that's a good question. We have two elements in the shadow selection. We have our steel blue object and our pink object, and so when we append an H3 to each of those two elements, it adds an H3 twice because there's two elements, and to each of those two elements that we've added, it sets their text to new H3 data. We can also kind of go the opposite way. If we have more elements on the page than we have data, if our colors array, for example, only had 3 colors on it, and we selected all the elements that we've added on the page, so we get back our same sort of weird selection with 7 elements in it. So this D3 select all H1, H2, H3. There's just 2 OR operators to grab everything, and if we try to attach our color data to it, we get back an array with only 3 elements because there's only 3 elements when data.color. And if we actually look at what's in this selection of all of our elements, if we look at the data attached, we can do .data on the selection to see the data inside of them. And I guess well, let's do something where we can see, let's attach some data where it's different. So we're going to attach an array of numbers instead. And if we do .data, we see that the first 3 elements have the new data attached to it, but the old elements have their old data still attached, which usually isn't what you want. If you're adding new things to the page, you kind of want those things to probably go away. So
data is always in a one-dimensional array?
Data can be, usually when you're actually building something with a visualization, you want to work with an array of objects. So each of your data properties can be multi-dimensional. It can be an array of arrays, and it can be basically anything. But it needs to be an array, and each entry in that array will get attached to an object. So we can sort of do something a little...
You have text also.
There's strings can be the elements in the array, or they can just be an object. Prop. Hi. If we do this, that's valid too. And if we look at what's attached, we have this array of numbers that we added, an object with a property, a number, and some strings. We can put whatever we want in the array. And every entry in the array, when we call a function that's setting attributes, that entry will just get sent to that function. So usually it's a good idea to put the same kinds of things in your array so your same function can operate on everything. But you're not required to do that. But just like there's an enter function, there's also an exit function. And .exit gives us back a selection with 7 elements in it, but the first 3 of them, the 3 things that have data entering that's actually bound to them, are not defined. We only have the last 4 elements of the page that will not have anything attached to them when this selection runs with the new data. And you can kind of see that even more clearly if we were to run a nice little transition, and when that transition ends, or we'll style their color to be equal to gray, and then when the transition ends, we're going to take those elements off the page. And these are going gray, and then they disappear, and if we look at our inspector, we see that there's only a couple of H1 and we only have our title, the H2 elements, and nothing else on the page. So that's basically the sort of very basics about how you attach data to elements on the page. But a lot of the times you're going to be working with nothing on the page and data that you've already defined. And to sort of get into how that would work a little bit, I've added this page is loading speech.js, which if you just look at it, it's a big array of strings which are paragraphs in Pericles' funeral oration, and you can just access it automatically if you type data in the console, and the whole array of strings will show up. What?
What?
You just type data. That's all it is.
Oh, data in the console.
Data in the console, and you get access to it. Yeah?
What's the exit for on the end of the data and the last?
Yeah, so the exit, when we call exit, we're getting just the elements that will not have any data attached to them. So there's 7 elements on the page, 3 data elements, 4 don't have anything left. So those are the elements that are exit.
And what was the enter for when you were doing child?
Right, so the enter does the opposite. If you have less elements on the page, then you have data elements. Enter will get a little shadow selection of all the things that don't have an element on the page yet. And usually you want to do enter.append or a div or a rectangle or something to attach a new object on the page for your new data. And right, so we probably want to get rid of, or we can leave that on the page, whatever. So we're going to start by selecting our body again. We're going to use data to just bind this array of strings to the page. And we're going to use the enter selection again to just get the new things that are entering. And on each of those things, we're going to append a div. And to that div, we're going to put some text. And we're passing, instead of a string to text, we're going to give text a function. And text is going to take our data element and the index of the element in the selection, and it's going to return the index plus some space and then the actual text of the data.
The function always have 2 parameters?
The functions, yeah, you can define it with just 1 parameter if you don't want to use the index like that. But yeah, you can also put K or Z, but those are never going to be defined, and they'll just always be equal to null.
You can have it no parameters at all?
What are you asking?
What you can do with no parameters at all?
You can do it with no parameters, sure, if you just want to return a constant.
Oh, okay.
But at that point, you might as well just put your constant here, right? And it doesn't even have to be a string. It can be like if you've defined a constant somewhere else on the page, you can do it like that. But there's no reason to call a function if you're not going to be doing something different for every element in the selection. So this looks like it almost worked on the side. We have some paragraphs of text, and each of them start with an index. But if you've spent time with computers, you should see that something's wrong here. Our first element on the page actually starts with a 1, and it should be starting with a 0, because that's just how counting works. And if we look at the actual text of the speech, we see that this first little paragraph doesn't actually match what our first paragraph here is. And with a little bit of investigation, we can figure out why that's happening. If we go to our body element, if we do D3 select, D3.select body, and see what data is attached to the body, it's actually the first paragraph of the speech. And the reason why that's happened, when we call D3 select body .data.enter, our selection already has 1 element in it. We've already had the D3.select body, oops, that's already part of our selection. So our enter shadow selection, we only have 12 elements in that because the first one is already getting mapped to body. And we don't want to do that. We want to just have one paragraph for one div. So the way you get around that is you make sure you have an empty shadow selection. And we're going to get rid of all the divs that we have on the page first. So we can try this again. So select all div, and then just dot remove will clear everything. And if we go back to this, if we do select all div, there's no divs on the page right now. So when we make this selection, we're going to actually get back an array with 13 elements, and each of them are not going to have an HTML node to them. So when we get ready to append things to them, we're going to get our full amount of divs. And we run it again with our totally empty shadow selection, and it starts correctly, which is what we wanted.
So if you had divs on the page already?
So if you already had divs on the page, you would be modifying the text inside of those divs to be equal to what your text is. And the way you get around that is making sure instead of starting out with your selection on the whole body, you select like my data place as your starting selection, and then .select all divs will only look inside of all the descendants of my data place for new divs. And hopefully that won't have any divs in it. It should probably be empty when you're starting. Okay, so cool. This is neat. It would be nice if we could sort of color these paragraphs in the same way that we've done before, but actually use the data in a meaningful manner to do that. D3 provides a lot of helper functions, just in the same way that it's provided nice wrappers around native JavaScript DOM manipulation. It also provides a bunch of sort of nice wrappers around common math operations that we would be doing over and over again in a very similar way. And one of those ways is with D3.scale. There's a bunch of different scales, and you can see them if you let the autocomplete start. There's linear scales, there's log scales, ordinal scales, power scales, and then some trickier ones at the bottom too that people don't use too much. So we're just going to use D3.scale linear. And we're going to try to use this to color the paragraphs based on how long they are. So just do scale equals, this is going to make a new linear scale for us. And what's our scale equal to now? It's a function that returns output of x. And if we try to call that, it doesn't look super useful at first. It's just giving us back what we send to it. If we investigate a little bit further, we can see that the scale's domain goes from 1 to 0, and the scale's range also goes from 1 to 0. So that's why it's not doing any sort of useful mapping. If we change the range to be a little bit bigger, if we make it go from, you can make it go from 50 to 1,000, and call it again with 0.5, we get back the middle of this range because 0.5 is in the middle of the domain and it's a linear scale. You can sort of play around with that a little bit more. Scale.0.9 gives you something that's closer. 9 will get you something very close to the end of the domain will get you something very close to the end of the range. And this sort of pattern of D3 letting you look up scales.range with an empty call like this, and allowing you to set range by passing it parameters, and all the scales basically take an array of starting and endpoints, so you can change the scale. Yeah. When you pass it, when you don't give range any arguments, it returns what the range actually is. But when you give range arguments that make sense, i.e. an array with elements in it, it returns back the range, and it lets you sort of chain things in the same way that you were able to chain selections before. But we want to be chaining, if we're going to be coloring the paragraphs, we want to have it be ranging instead of from numbers to colors. So we're going to just go from red to blue. And if we call the scale function again with 0, we start getting back colors. And I don't know hex values off the top of my head, but if we just do D3 select, we can set the whole body's color to scale of 0.2. Oops. And you have to select the body, not just pass it body, which doesn't mean anything right now, and style. It becomes red, and if we pass it, set the color equal to scale 0.8, it's blue, and we can kind of see that the scale is making sense. But that's only the output of the scale. Our scale.range is still equal, or the domain of our scale is still only going from 0 to 1, which isn't really what we want it to do. We'd like it to go from the longest to the shortest element, longest and shortest paragraph in this block of text. So JavaScript comes with a nice little map function, and it's just a property of every array. If you take an array of some numbers and you call map on it, map takes a single function as an argument, and we're going to use the same pass your data element as your argument, and it's going to call this function on every single element of this array and return a new array with the result of this function. So if you want to multiply everything times 3, you just multiply everything times 3, and you get back a new array with the elements multiplied times 3. You can do something like that, where you're getting powers of 2 with your elements, and lots of fun stuff. But our data element, we can also call map on it because it's just an array, and we're going to do map, and instead of trying to raise it to a power or something, we're just going to get the length of our string. And whoops. Oh, this function that I've passed map, it doesn't have a return value, so every element in our new array is just going to be undefined because our function didn't give back any values. We have to do return d.length to actually create an array with those values. And we see that we have just a bunch of numbers. There's 13 of them, which is good. If we scroll down, we see the shortest paragraph is the last one, and it looks like it has about 94 characters in it, so that makes sense. This is almost what we want, but we need to just get the shortest and the longest element of the array. And D3 comes in to be able to pass to D3.domain, so we'll have a nice mapping. D3 has another convenience function that'll help with that, D3.extent, and this also takes an array and just returns the biggest and the smallest values in it. So D3.extent of that will give us back 50 and 10. And we call the same extent function on our mapping, on our array of string lengths. We're going to get back the shortest string and the length of the longest paragraph. And we can just keep wrapping things up, and usually you want to stop at a certain point because things will get a little bit ugly, but we're going to keep going. And we're going to pass this array of 94 and 2119 to scale.domain. And now, with those, now that our scale domain has been set up and its range is going from colors, we can select all of our paragraphs. So just select all div and style color based on the data element, and instead of just passing back D like we did before when D was a color, we're going to return the result of scale D.length, which is going to take our data element, our string, get its length, and transform that length into a color. And all we have to do is pass this function, and it works. And it's just like magic. Our divs have changed color just like that. And it looks like it makes sense. The shortest ones are red, and longest one is blue. This isn't a particularly exciting or useful data visualization. It's just some colored text. If we wanted to make it this information a little easier to read, we could make a simple bar graph, which is what we're going to try to do next. So this text is kind of getting in the way, and we're just going to select it and get rid of it. But even though we've gotten rid of the text, if we look at our sort of inspector, all those divs are still there. And the nice thing about it is they still have all of their data attached. And I just called .data on it, and it printed out this really long array of strings for me.
How did you delete? Sorry.
Oh yeah, what are you asking?
How did you delete the text but delete the note?
Yeah, so all it was we can do it again. So if we do D3.select text, here is text. That's just going to set the text on the page equal to here's text. And then to delete the text, we just pass it an empty string. And then that sets the inner text equal to an empty string, which isn't anything. So we're going to use our same sort of scale function, but instead of mapping to a color, we're going to map to a range. And I'm just guessing it looks like this page is about 0 to 300 pixels wide. And now if we pass it scale, we'll just take the first string in our data. We take the first element of our data and get its length and pass that to scale. We're going to get back a number that goes from 0 to 300, and we're going to use that number to make a bar chart. So how are we going to do that? We need to select our divs again, and we need to style them, and we're going to set their widths equal to a function, and that function is going to return exactly what we did before. So scale of D.length. And boom, nothing happened. And that's because the divs are 0 pixels tall. So we're gonna make them a little bit taller. Style height. And we're just going to set it below 100 pixels, and I think we might need to do that for here too. Let's see if that works.
What about setting the background? Are we actually?
Oh yeah. Let's try that. Boom. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so here we have a nice little bar chart, which is sort of unreadable right now because they're not separated. And we can give them a little bit of space. Style. And it's a bar chart representing the length of paragraphs as we go through the speech. And this, unfortunately, is about as far as you can go with just CSS and HTML. You're not able to really create like maps or sort of bouncing interactivity or really fun things. You can still make a pretty cool thing with the bar chart. One thing, just using these techniques that you can make yourself that I made, is this graph of the NBA draft over the past couple of years, and it's basically just using the same principles. We can actually see them in play a little bit if we inspect what's up. This is every draft class. Every bar on this page represents a single player. In each draft, the players on the left were drafted first, the players on the right were drafted later, and players whose bars are more red perform better over their careers. So you can see the players who sort of beat expectations, like Monte Ellis.
That guy right there.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Isaiah Thomas.
Was that? Oh.
Yeah. Isaiah Thomas. And that's sort of not super accurate because it's only has 2 years of stuff. But if you click on any of these bars, if we want to see what's up with Klay Thompson, Chrome's dev tools are pretty cool. So I've selected that element with the magnifying glass. You can do $0 to get it, and D3 select also takes a node as a parameter, not just CSS selectors. So now we can play around with D3 and we can see the actual data attached to it. And we see it's Klay Thomas, what sort of impact metric we have for him, and his stats array, which is just minutes played and years, and that goes into generating into bar graphs. You can do that for any player, and it sort of just uses this information to sort of iteratively go through, and first you make a bunch of divs to contain the player divs representing a year, and then each of those divs has its data attached to it, and then you color the data based on what the players are, and then you just add mouse over effects with bars based on how well players did in certain years, and it's just arrays of arrays of arrays nested a couple of levels down and appending to them to the page. Does anybody have any questions before we get to SVGs? Yeah?
This was before, so I need to go back, but if you
Yeah.
accidentally hit that tangle, if I accidentally assign something to like, blew out like, is already reset it.
You assign something to length?
Yeah, I managed to assign them the color values when I actually scaled out the color values. I actually, in this stuff, I assigned it to length, so not length is things.
So two things you can do to sort of
Reset that.
catch up. I should have mentioned this before.
Well, I'm caught up. I just don't know how to reset that particular wall.
Oh,
Tell it to be length again.
to reset things, it's pretty simple. You just press F5 and everything's gone.
Oh, well, I actually meant just to reset that particular thing.
Refresh?
Yeah.
No, I meant is there a way just to tell length to start acting like length?
I'm not sure about that. You really shouldn't mess with stuff like that in JavaScript. It can really fight your hands.
It's just in the DOM. I mean, it's just right. It's just assigned. It gave length like a constant value.
Okay.
Right.
Like length, like this variable length, or
Like, yeah, when I call the length of those boxes of text,
Mhm.
coming back with the length of the text, it comes back with the hex color value that's assigned.
oh,
So I
okay.
was saying, is there a way to tell length that sorry?
Yeah,
don't be a
I'm not
constant
sure.
anymore, go back to actually being a property on that element.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't think I got scale assigned, right? Because I look at things like 20, in fact, maybe 10. So the scale's left over. So
What'd you ask?
you show me your scale that you're using to use the blocks. How does that work?
Yeah, so it's just scale. The domain is equal to the domain, and the range is that. And you can recreate it pretty easily with just scale.
Well, my actually my domain is range, so now
I'm not sure. You might be calling scale incorrectly. Are you returning scale d.length? And then are you adding pixels at the end?
Pixels to width.
Yeah, so CSS width requires, because it could be a percentage or EMs, you have to specify pixels, I think.
Oh, okay. What is that?
You can use percentage, right? For
You could
PX?
yeah, you could use percentage too. I'm not sure what that would look like.
So there's only two available, PX and percentage. Is that,
I think EM might be one too.
what's that stand for?
How big an M is?
M?
Just like the letter M, the lowercase m.
Okay. Right to use, I guess, right?
Any other questions? Okay, cool. So I'm just gonna take what we have so far and just throw it out. And we're gonna transition to something a little bit different, and that's SVGs. So just with CSS and HTML, we basically can draw some colored boxes, but that's about it. SVGs allow us to draw lines, so we can make boxes that have more sides or circles, and it also allows us to sort of animate things in a much nicer manner. To type the stuff in the next section, I'm going to use Chrome's sources panel. You don't have to do that, but if you want to, you click sources, snippets, and then you can just make a new one. Right. So move that out of the way a little bit. We're gonna just make a width and a height for our SVG that we can reuse without having to type the same constant over and over. We'll do 400 and 400 again.
That was 2% left.
And we're going to take our body selection and add a SVG to the page. So var SVG equals D3 select body dot append SVG, and we need to set the SVG's properties to be its width equal to our width and its height equal to the height that we're using. So run that, and what do we have? We have,
So it takes the whole page.
if you press Control Enter, you can run it, and it should.
Quick question.
Yeah?
How do you create the new snippet? I've just not seen that in the inspector. I see snippets and
Oh,
all in the module.
yeah. So you go to Sources,
Yeah.
click on this little sort of thing on the left hand, this
Yeah.
arrow on the left hand corner of the navigator,
Yeah.
snippets, and then right click New Snippet. Okay. So if we run that, we get bigger. We have an SVG on the page, and it's totally empty. It's just a white box where we can draw things, and that's not super exciting. So let's spice it up a little bit with a rectangle. SVG, similar to HTML, has elements that you can add. Rectangle is one of them, so it takes an X attribute, a Y attribute, and a width, and we're just going to set the width equal to 100 and the height equal to 100 again. And we can run this, and now we have a SVG with a rectangle in it, which is also not that exciting, but still pretty cool. to sort of take what we were using before, we can also add elements driven by data. So we're going to use D3.range to just quickly generate some junk data. It's a really useful helper function. If you just pass it a number by itself, it gives you an array with 0 going up to that many elements in the number. And if you're familiar with sort of Python's syntax, it uses a similar thing. So if we want to start at 0, go to width, and go up by 10 every time, we'll get back an array like that. So this time, let's add some circles. So we have to do our sort of phantom selection. We're going to select all circle, and we're going to attach data, D3 range 0, width 10, and that's going to just give us back an empty array, or our array with counting up to 400 by 10, and do .enter to get back all of our shadow selections, append a new circle, and let's add those circles to the page. Circles take a radius. We'll just set the radius equal to 5. A x coordinate, we'll set that equal to, we'll have the x coordinate vary by how far along we are, or we'll take function of d and just do return d, and y for now can just be a constant, so we'll do the y coordinate of our circle is just going to be 200. If we run that, we get back our box and some circles attached to it on the bottom. And that box is kind of ugly, so I'm going to delete it. And we can do some more fun stuff with the circles. We can, instead of just printing them out in a line like that, we can sort of make a nice little sine wave. So if we do take function and return math.sine of d divided by 200 times the height plus the height over 2. Sorry about that. We could use a scale here instead, but since I know sine goes from -1 to 1, and we want the height to go from 0 to 400, we can just transform it like that. And we get another SVG, but it's going down instead of like how I would have wanted it to be if it was a sine function. Let me see if this will work. Yeah, so this is a little bit closer to a sine function. It's still sort of messy and we're going back and forth too quickly. That's still not working. But if I could do the math right on this, you would be able to, with these circles, you can also, any sort of data visualization program you have or graphing program should be able to display circles in a pattern. One place that D3 really shines, and the reason for it existing, is that we can execute code along with the visualization when people are looking at it. So for these circles, we can select all of them. We can take our circles and we can make them interactive with .on. And .on, basically, you pass it two things. First, the type of event you're listening for, so we're going to listen for mouse over, and a function that should run when that event happens. So we're going to take D and I, And just like just like every other selection, we haven't used it before. You also get this, and that's going to be bound to the circle that's just been moused over. And we're going to select it again with D3 so we can modify it easily. And we'll set the X attribute equal to 400 minus D. So now all the circles on the page have a mouse over event attached to them, and they're not actually doing anything. Yeah? Yeah, that's exactly right. When I'm mousing over, I'm changing the circle's X attribute, and if we go and look at it, we can see that it has R is equal to 5, like we said it, C is equal to 70, CY is equal to where it is, but X is equal to 330, and X isn't actually useful for anything, and the browser doesn't understand what a circle with the property of X is, so we need to set the CX property instead of the X property. And now if we mouse over them, they are translated over, which, you know, it's not really useful for anything, but it's kind of fun. And we can make it a little bit more fun if we add a nice little transition to it. So that's just going to animate the moving of the circles as we mouse over them. And there we go. Which, you know, yeah, you can basically do whatever you want with them. Transition has an end event, so they can bounce back or change colors, or we can even chain transitions together. So this is getting a little bit hard to read, so I'm going to move it up to a snippet. Let's see. I'll just put it here. So this is our mouse over effect. We're selecting the element here, and we run this transition, and on this transition we modify this attribute. If we want to have something else play after we've done this, we can run another transition, and that transition will start when the first one's ended. So we can do CY, it's going to be 400, it's just going to be equal to D again. And if we take out that semicolon I put there, we can change other properties like the radius, and make the radius equal to 10, and the opacity equal to 0.5.
You can also loop that piece of code, right? Loop it.
Yeah, sure. You can do a loop too if you wanted to, when you mouse over it the first time, to make it keep going perpetually. D is not defined. Oops. Oh, this curly bracket has to go down here because it's all taking place within this one function. So if we modify the mouse over event, nope, it's an extra semicolon. The semicolon stops the method chaining from working. There. So did that actually work? I don't think it did. That's unfortunate. Does anyone see what's wrong with it?
You still have the semicolon in the console.
Do I?
In the console.
Oh.
Bottom.
Try again.
No. There it goes. So our circles are getting big. When we mouse over them, you know, also not particularly useful, but if we have actual, there we go. If we have data that we want to visualize that's attached to these circles, it's not that many steps to go from what we have here to the visualization of taxes that I showed earlier. I'm not sure which Chrome tab I have that on, so I can't go back to it. And what D3 really allows you to do once you've gotten a feel for playing with it is to not be bound. You're only really constrained by what you can, this sort of visualization of taxes being
So
paid by different industries.
You're
Yeah.
a data journalist, is that right?
Yeah, that's where a lot of this cutting edge work is taking place, is at the New York Times, and they're making this pretty dry informations about common tax rates that utilities pay versus what healthcare pays, like a lot more accessible and easy to use. And so you can go that direction with it. It's another way you can sort of bind data to the DOM in a sort of fun way. This is less useful for creating visualizations, but if we go back to the rectangle, and modify our code a little bit, if we, instead of, we put this inside of a add rect function, and parameterize a little bit. So we're gonna pass add rect a size and an x and a y value. We can do some pretty fun recursive interactions. So we're gonna create a mouse over effect. So on every time we mouse over one of these rectangles, we're gonna call this function, and this function is going to call add rect, but it's gonna, the size is gonna be divided by 2. And our x and y position are going to be randomized. So we're going to call math.random times the width and math.random times the height. And we also need to call this function once at the beginning. So function, or just add rect of 100, and we're going to put it in the middle of the screen. So this creates a new, oops. What's wrong?
Math.random needs parentheses.
Yep. I think there's another one though, because we haven't gotten that far. Shoot.
Do we have to enclose the function?
Yeah, I didn't even start the function, so it needs a curly bracket here, and it also needs a closing curly bracket. There we go. So now we have a rectangle down here, and when we mouse over it, we get another rectangle that's half the size. And, you know, it's kind of cool. We can make it a little bit more exciting if instead of black rectangles, we change their colors. So we'll do attribute fill and RGB do math.random. That's correct. Times 256 or 255, and I don't want to have to type that a few more times, so we're just going to keep green and blue the same. So if we run that,
An extra comma
I have an extra comma
for the 100.
for which 100? This one?
What is that supposed to be there?
Are you concatenating a string? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm making this string here. Let me see if I did it wrong.
You need extra
You think so? Nope. Well, I know this will work. We can change the opacity, which is also neat to see. So just do 100 times math.random. No, it takes everything. No, RGB, we're just setting this style property equal to
This whole exercise raises the question of, is there any kind of something that allows you to do that?
yeah, that's sort of a really big issue that makes D3 sort of a stumbling block and hard to get into. Yeah, that's part of why I'm using the Chrome Dev Console, and one of the things that I guess I'm trying to get across but not doing a great job of is, well, it's not going to be useful for debugging this problem, but for a whole host of other problems. If you're willing to use the inspector and D3, you can sort of figure stuff out a little bit better. So if I just pick one of my circles, I can see what its actual properties are and how it's being changed. I should pick one of the squares? Okay. So I'll get one of the squares that was supposed to have a fill selected. And yeah, so the fill was just being set to nothing. So we can go back and try to see why that's happening. I'm not sure why that's happening though, because this should be passing an actual value. Like, that part of it's correct.
Can you give it a constant value, like just set it to red?
Wait. No. Where do you think there should be a semicolon? No. It doesn't need to return the string because we're not calling a function on each of these. We're just, this string is getting evaluated right here and it's giving back a string.
Why don't you try just a constant number on all these guys?
I should
Instead of
just
using
try
random.
okay, sure. So we'll just try 200.
You have to take out the second.
Yeah. And the def constructors. So that works. But it would be a little more fun if we can change the colors. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. One way of differentiating them, we can do their style, stroke, width, and set that equal to 1. Nope, that also didn't work. So that's an excellent segue into how you can learn more about D3 and sort of get better at it. Something I still need to work on clearly. So this was supposed to be at the end of creating an awesome interactive sort of playful thing. One on my site that I actually got working is this Sierpinski triangle, and it's interactive and you can zoom. It's pretty cool and it's like 25 lines of code and awesome. I probably should have tried to just remake this instead.
That reminds me of Fractals.
It's
Self-similarity.
It is a fractal. I mean, we're just basically doing the same thing. Taking one big triangle, adding a mouse over event to add smaller triangles to the page, and continuously doing that. And the rectangle should have worked the same way, but it wasn't. Just wasn't going to happen. So how do you get better at D3? If you actually want to use D3 in your work and sort of just do the same sort of visualizations that you've been doing before, but maybe add a nice mouse over effect or add some interactivity that you haven't had before, going to the D3 gallery on GitHub and looking at the basic charts is a great way to start. Each of these sort of, if you click on one of them, there's a nice little example sort of explaining where to look up more, links to more tutorials, and then the actual code itself, which is sort of very dense and terse, but that's because it's operating in the same sort of declarative way that we were looking at before. So the whole idea is that you only tell D3 what you're trying to do. So if you want to create a timescale that outputs its range to the width of the screen, you just type these two sentences and it automatically works for you. Another great resource, and sort of in a similar vein, Mike Bostock's has a fun site where he just posts all of his recent GIST and GitHub examples. So if you just scroll through this and see something that looks cool or looks like something that you might want to use, he's been doing a lot of maps recently, and click on it, you get the example along with, and this is how to build a pie chart with transitions, along with some text, links to tutorials about how to do it correctly, and then the actual code for the example. And I really encourage you to, hopefully you sort of know enough now to go into this and modify with it and play with it a little bit and get better at it. Other good resources, there's the GitHub page has a sort of wiki attached to it, and the two best things on it are the API reference and the tutorials and talks. The API reference, when you're going through one of these examples, you're going to run into stuff which just doesn't make that much sense because you haven't seen it before, like D3.json is a nice way of loading things, but you won't have any idea how to use that if you're just reading for the first time. So if you go to the API reference, search for D3.json, you get instructions on how to use it. And there's also a ton of tutorials and talks links that people will probably be having things working. If you're having trouble with your actual modifying things on the page and you're looking at the dev console and something's not working, the Mozilla Developer Network is pretty good if you, especially if you're trying to build something with D3 that hasn't been built before, and really pushing the boundaries of what's possible. You need to know what's possible in terms of what kind of shapes SVGs can render easily. For example, if you want to animate a path sort of growing, the best way of doing that is by modifying the path's pattern property, and basically give it a dotted stroke that expands as it animates, which isn't intuitive at all, and you sort of have to be willing to play around a little bit with SVGs to get that. The last place you can go for help is just Stack Overflow. There's a ton of questions and answers, and people are generally pretty helpful on it. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions or anything?
I'm curious what your everyday job is like doing these stuff, right?
Yeah, so my everyday job, we basically scrape people's brokerage accounts. It's sort of like Mint, but for your investment data, and I make visualizations of that data so you can sort of understand the risk profile of your portfolio without needing a degree in multivariate calculus by sort of making animated, intuitive graphs.
Oh, so you're into financial stuff? Visualization.
Yeah, and it's about half D3 and half getting data that D3 can use.
Can you talk more about formatting data for it?
Why'd you ask?
Can you talk more about formatting data for it?
Yeah, so I'm coming at all of this from sort of a math background, and one thing I really picked up from it is that notation is extremely important. If you can express the data you have clearly and concisely and put that into D3, everything flows much cleaner and much nicer. The best practices for doing things with D3, you want to operate with an array of objects. So if you, like in the basketball player example, you start out with, I started with basketballreference.com and just scraped information from their page and sort of condensed things by player and only got the attributes of players that I wanted to keep, how many minutes they played in the season, and what their player efficiency rating was for that season, the player's name, and only stuck that into D3. And that's how to go about it, I guess. To actually do that, to actually get data on the web page, D3 comes with a couple of nice convenience functions. The one that I was mentioned before, D3.json, will make a asynchronous request to a just any URL that has a JSON file sitting on it, and so you pass it 2 arguments, and you can see his example here. You pass D3.json the URL of the actual data file that represents your data, and a function that will run once that data has loaded. And there's a sort of similar pattern for a bunch of common data types. There's D3.json for JSON data, CSVs and TSVs are really the best way to go. If you have something that's just like pretty simple and can be represented in the tabular form, CSV is going to do that most efficiently because there's only going to be the overhead of commas in the data. But if you have sort of nested hierarchical data, you probably want to go with JSON. Does that answer it? What's your question?
Just with the basketball, I have a data set with multiple years, but some of them people overlap. So did you put that into a JSON file instead of like year? Is that how you did it?
Yeah, we can actually just go look at it pretty easily. So it's wrong one. We want the NBA draft, and we need to have the developer console open to see what we're downloading. And if we go, and you can do this on any visualization on the web. Oops, inspect. Reload. Because everything's using sort of open standards and is running on your computer, you can investigate a little bit and see exactly what's happening. So we're loading drafts.json, and I did this a couple of months ago, so I'm not even exactly sure what's inside of this. And we see it's giving us back an array of players.
You did this for your own interest?
Yeah, I don't know. The draft was coming up, and I was sort of curious about it, so I made this. Once you sort of have practice with it, the real, and especially for me at this point, the limiting factor isn't so much making the data visualization or putting it on the web. It's coming up with, finding an interesting data source and coming up with an interesting way of showing it that's like useful and interesting to people.
Fantasy sports.
Yeah.
People would go to your site just for like getting some insight.
Okay.
And you can sell ads, and then you can make money.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, like 3D.js?
Yeah, so that's the 3D thing, right? If you, another resource which I didn't list because it's not super helpful if you're just getting started, D3 has a Google Groups, and I haven't experienced anything directly with it, but I've sort of read threads. It's kind of interoperable, but there's really, you don't get that much out of it because 3.js isn't, D3 doesn't have nice ways of manipulating those objects, I guess. You can do it though.
Is there anything there for 3Ds?
They had a thread about that like a year and a half ago, I think, and the creator of D3 is just like, I think 3D data visualizations are a terrible idea and nobody should do them. So that sort of ended the discussion on the D3 users group. But if you were going to do it, I would probably recommend 3.js and